Low end and bass frequencies are some of the hardest to manage in almost any mix. It always seems like it's either too muddy or too thin, and it's really hard to find the sweet spot. This is especially true if you're working on tracks with a lot of synth bass, 808s, kicks, and anything else that's taking up space in the subs. So today I'm going to show you some tricks for working with bass tracks. I'll show you how to get it to sound big, full, and clear without sounding muddy. Let's get started. The track I'm working on has 3 types of bass parts: an 808, the hook has a Reese bass, and then later in the second verse we have this sub bass. Already, there's a lot we can learn from this session just by looking at the arrangement. You notice how there's only ever one type of bass happening at the same time. This is a great rule of thumb for 99% of tracks. You don't want to stack a bunch of different basses on top of each other. For example, an 808 on top of a Reese bass is going to be incredibly difficult to make it sound clear without getting muddy. Now, there can be some exceptions, but generally, if you're layering bass sounds, only one of those layers should be occupying the bulk of the low end. And the other layers that you add should really only be higher frequencies that are adding texture. You might even roll off a bunch of lows in all the layers that you're using so that only one of those tracks is really bringing the low end. Now here's something I like to look for. We can see that this 808 is ringing out a little bit into where this sub bass starts. And it's going to be good to clean this up. Listen to what it sounds like. It's just not as clean right when that sub bass cuts in. We're still hearing a little bit of the 808 rub against the sub bass. So right now we're going to cut the 808 when the sub bass begins, and then we'll place a little fade so there's not a click. Now it's just much tighter and cleaner when we switch from the 808 to the sub bass. And we no longer have that low frequency rubbing happening that's creating this kind of muddy moment in the mix. Now, before we move on from talking about the arrangement, there's one more thing that this session does really well. And that is there's no low end coming from other instruments in the track, other than the kick, of course. And this isn't because we took high pass filters and dramatically rolled everything off. It's because the arrangement, the actual parts that were played in the correct octave so that they stay out of the way of the low end and they occupy a higher frequency range. See, if you're trying to jam a bunch of keys and pads and synths and other instruments into the lower frequencies that the bass is in, it's going to sound muddy when it comes time to mix. Instead of doing that, try pulling some of those elements up an octave or even up 2 octaves to get out of the way of the bass. Let the bass be by itself in the low end and let the instruments kind of fill in around it in the higher range. Listen to what I mean. Here's the track with all the basses muted.
I didn't know you would have me whip like that though. I'm swimming in your love, baby, backstroke. Got me spending all my money, baby, cash flow.
So there's absolutely no low end when we mute the 808, and that allows this 808 to be nice and big and full and solid in the low end.
I didn't know you would have me whip like that though. I'm swimming in your love, baby, backstroke. Got me spending all my money, baby, cash flow.
So a good arrangement is the first step to getting good low end in a mix. But of course, there are some cheat codes we can use to get this bass even bigger and tighter in this mix. And I'm going to show you that now. First, let's look at this Reese bass in the hook. I want this to sound even bigger and thicker. And so I'm going to pull up X-Rack Pro on this track. There's one specific compressor that is absolutely amazing on low frequency instruments like this. And that is this satin compressor. It just fills up the lows really nicely. It doesn't have the other problems that a lot of compressors have with low end, like where it clamps down and kind of chokes it, makes it sound small. This one actually makes it sound bigger. Take a listen. And it's also more even sounding now as well, which is contributing to how solid the low end sounds. Now, another trick I like to use is with the sub and low slider on the tone module. And I just want to reshape this low end a little bit. A lot of times mixes that you perceive as having big low end and big bass don't usually have as much sub as you would think. A lot of times it's a little bit less sub and a little bit more of this higher low end, which gives us that feeling of massive bass in a mix. So I'm just going to reshape this low end a little bit. I'm going to push the lows up and pull the sub down. Now, if we did it right, we didn't necessarily hear a dramatic difference. However, because of the boosts and cuts that we're making, we are actually cleaning up the subs significantly, and instead we're shifting some of that energy up a little bit into a range that's, one, a little bit more audible on smaller speakers, and two, a little bit easier for our mastering limiter to handle so that we can get it louder and cleaner without getting any crunch from the limiter. I also like using this sub slider more than a high pass filter a lot of times because we don't want to completely lose the sub information. We want that to be there. We just want a little bit less of it. And this is a much more gentle, natural way to deal with it. Now, if I really want to take this bass and make it sound insanely huge, I'll go over to the maximize module and use this massive mode. And if I just pull up the multi slider, you're going to hear how the low end just blooms out. Now, this is actually a multiband dynamics process, which allows us to bring up the low end without allowing the peaks to jump up. So we're compressing the lows and bringing it all up, and it just creates this even bigger sound. So let's listen before and after X-Rack Pro and everything we've done. Now, if you're listening on good speakers or headphones even, you're going to notice how that low end just completely filled out with this processing. Let's listen to it in the context of the mix.
Forever in my head was never gonna end. As soon as it began, oh yeah, baby, this shit forever. Ain't no chance for a nigga to get you back.
So I love what that sounds like. I can copy this over to the sub bass as well and check it there. Now, this particular bass has kind of a high frequency buzz sound, which is very cool, but I don't want to bring that out quite as much. And what's bringing that out is this maximize module, because we're applying the multiband compression to the entire spectrum. So on this track, I actually want to bring the high amount down so that we're not going to bring up any high-end buzz or hiss in this sound. So now we're just getting the effect we want of that big, thick low end without bringing up any additional buzz. So now I'll copy this over to the 808 track as well. But on this one, I'm going to make some changes. I'll show you some things I like to do specifically with 808s. First off, instead of boosting the lows, I'm actually going to boost the mids a little bit more here. And that's because 808s tend to have a lot more interesting mid ranges. I found that's where they get a lot of their character from. It's not quite as much in the lows, it's a little bit more in the mids. So you hear that little dirt in the 808 that we're bringing out with the mid-range. Just sounds really nice and full. I am still going to keep this sub cut a little bit just to clean up the subs more. Now, in addition to that, there's a saturation trick that I really like to use on 808s like this. If I switch over to the bus sat mode and I make it a little bit warmer, I can push this saturation up and we're going to get a really nice kind of subtle saturation happening on this 808. I love what that sounds like. I'm going to show you kind of a more advanced trick here. If I go to the tone routing section of X-Rack Pro, I can click pre, and this is going to take the entire tone module and put it before everything else in the chain. So now instead of boosting the mids after this saturation, now we're going to be boosting it going into the saturation. So it's going to have a little bit more natural sound. So when we had it in the default post dynamics mode, it was a little bit crunchy sounding on that saturation. But when we flip it to pre mode, now the saturation sounds a little bit more natural, a little bit more analog and full, because we're no longer applying EQ to the saturation sound. Now, just to demonstrate, listen to what the tape saturation sounds like versus the bus saturation. So two completely different sounding types of saturation, both can be really cool. There's even a 2-inch tape, which is a little different again from the cassette. Now, if I was going for that kind of really aggressive sounding 808, one of these tape saturations might be exactly what I'm looking for. But for this particular track, I don't want to completely change the feel and sound of the 808. I just wanted to give it a little bit more grit. And that's why I like this bus sat mode. So let's hear before and after X-Rack Pro on the 808. Now, one thing I want to point out, even though it sounds like the 808 is much louder with X-Rack Pro on, it's actually a little bit softer with X-Rack Pro on in terms of the peak level. Look at the meters here. So you see how the peak level is actually a few dB softer with X-Rack Pro on, even though the 808 sounds a little bigger and fuller. And that's because of all this processing that we're doing. Let's take a listen in the mix.
I didn't know you would have me whip like that though. I'm swimming in your love, baby, backstroke. Got me spending all my money, baby, cash flow. But I don't mind it all for you, it's just special.
Now there's one more trick that often gets thrown out whenever you're talking about low end fitting together. And that is the kick side chaining to the bass in order to allow the kick to cut through. Now in theory, it makes a lot of sense. And sometimes it's exactly the effect that you're going for in a particular mix. And in that case, setting up the side chaining is a great idea. It's very easy to do as well. I'm just going to send the kick out of bus. We'll say bus 21. Then I can come over to X-Rack Pro on the Reese bass track, set the key input to bus 21, and then just turn up the sidechain amount. And here's what that's going to sound like. I have the kick and Reese bass soloed out. Now this can definitely be a cool effect, and it's useful to know how to do it if that's the effect you're going for. But for me personally, on a track like this, it actually goes in the wrong direction, I think. The Reese bass should sound solid and full, and the kick was still cutting through enough. The kick doesn't always have to be the thing that has the biggest low end. And I think in this case, the side chaining actually distracts from how big the low end should sound. And this is a good lesson. A lot of times you don't need to do quite as much as you think you need to, especially if your arrangement is good. If you have good arrangement, good sound selection, you make sure that whatever kick you choose goes well with whatever bass you choose, then the mix becomes a lot easier and ultimately is going to sound a lot better. So these are some of my favorite tricks to use when I'm trying to get just a massive, big, low end sound. And they're super easy to dial in with X-Rack Pro. You can use them to get that elevated, massive low end. If you enjoyed this video and learned something, leave us a comment, give it a like, and subscribe for more tutorials like this. And as always, happy mixing.